A perfectly imperfect bride. Elizabeth Monroe sat in front of the grand gilded mirror in the bridal suite of La Lumiere, one of the most exclusive bridal boutiques in Manhattan. The warm, golden lighting illuminated her deep brown skin, making her look like she had stepped straight out of a bridal magazine. The silk of her wedding gown, pure white, with delicate lace trailing down the long sleeves, felt impossibly smooth against her fingertips. Every stitch was perfection, every bead meticulously placed by world-renowned designers. It was a dress fit for royalty, a symbol of everything her life was supposed to be. And yet, staring at her reflection, she felt nothing. Not joy, not excitement, not even mirrors, just emptiness. Her mother, Vivienne Monroe, sat elegantly on the cream-colored chaise lounge behind her, scrolling through her phone with one hand while sipping a glass of chilled champagne with the other. She was the epitome of grace and power, a woman who commanded every room she walked into, whose mere presence could silence an entire boardroom. "You're quiet," Vivienne noted without looking up. "That's not like you." Elizabeth forced a small smile. "Just thinking." Her mother glanced up, her sharp hazel eyes meeting Elizabeth's in the mirror. "Don't overthink, darling. Everything is in place. The venue, the dress, the guest list, it's all perfect." Perfect. That word had followed Elizabeth her entire life. From the elite private schools to the Ivy League degree, from the charity work to the carefully curated social circles, her life had been designed for perfection. And at the center of it all was Daniel Caldwell, the perfect fiancé. Tall, handsome, and heir to one of the most powerful financial empires in the country, Daniel was the man every woman dreamed of marrying. He had the effortless charm of old money and the presence of a man who had never known rejection. On paper, they were the perfect match. But in her heart, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Before Elizabeth could react, the boutique doors swung open and Daniel himself walked in. His presence filled the room immediately. Tailored navy suit, sharp jawline, and a confidence that was almost intoxicating. "Darling," he greeted smoothly, stepping toward her. "I had to see you." Vivienne beamed. "Daniel, you shouldn't be seeing the bride before the wedding." Daniel chuckled, ignoring the superstition as he leaned down to kiss Elizabeth's cheek. She caught the scent of his expensive cologne, crisp and familiar. "I couldn't wait until tomorrow." His voice was warm, affectionate even. And yet, it sent a strange discomfort rippling through her. She smiled, because that's what was expected. "You're not supposed to see the dress yet." He took a step back, hands in his pockets, looking at her with open admiration. "I don't need to. You'd look stunning in anything." Vivienne sighed dramatically. "Oh, Elizabeth, you're marrying a poet." Elizabeth laughed lightly, playing her role flawlessly. But Daniel had always been good with words. He knew exactly what to say, exactly how to charm. He reached for her hand, brushing his fingers over the engagement ring. A massive, custom-designed diamond. A statement of power as much as love. Tomorrow is going to be the start of something incredible. Elizabeth swallowed. "I know. Are you ready?" The question was simple, innocent, but it felt like a test. Was she ready? Ready to become Elizabeth Caldwell, the picture-perfect wife to a man who had already mapped out their life together. The life filled with black-tie galas, summers in the Hamptons, and endless obligations. A life that had been planned for her, rather than one she had chosen. Elizabeth forced a smile. "Of course." Daniel squeezed her hand. "Good, because the world will be watching." He was right. This wasn't just a wedding. It was an event. The guest list included politicians, CEOs, celebrities, people who would whisper in hushed tones about how she and Daniel were the new power couple of their generation. And yet, standing there in her wedding gown, she felt like a supporting character in someone else's story. The girl in the mirror wasn't her. She was the version of Elizabeth Monroe that the world expected. The obedient daughter, the trophy fiancée, the future Mrs. Caldwell. Vivian clinked her champagne glass against Daniel's. To a perfect future. Perfect. That word again. Elizabeth smiled, but inside, something was unraveling. As Daniel and Vivian discussed the final wedding arrangements, Elizabeth turned back to the mirror. She searched for something, some flicker of certainty, some spark of joy. But all she saw was a woman standing at the edge of a choice she didn't even realize she needed to make. And for the first time, she wondered, what if this wasn't the life she was meant to have? What if she had made the wrong choice? And most terrifying of all, what if it wasn't too late to change everything? A ghost from the past. The wedding day arrived in a flurry of silk and whispers. Elizabeth sat in the lavish bridal suite of the Carlisle estate, a historic mansion-turned-wedding venue on the outskirts of New York. It was the kind of place that graced the covers of wedding magazines, with towering marble columns, endless rose gardens, and chandeliers that sparkled like captured stars. The air buzzed with excitement. Bridesmaids adjusted their satin gowns, stylists perfected her hair and makeup, and wedding coordinators moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, ensuring that every detail was executed flawlessly. And yet, beneath it all, Elizabeth felt like she was drowning. She smoothed her hands over her gown, feeling the weight of the moment pressing into her chest. In just an hour, she would walk down that grand aisle, toward a future that had been written for her long before she ever had a say in it. Her mother's voice cut through the chaos. "Elizabeth, sit still. The makeup artist needs to touch up your blush." Elizabeth barely heard her. She was staring at the wedding invitation on the vanity before her. Elizabeth Monroe and Daniel Caldwell. Together in love, together in forever. Forever. Her throat tightened. A soft knock at the door made her snap out of her daze. A bridesmaid poked her head inside. "Lizzie, the guests are starting to arrive. The groomsmen are all here, and, well, you won't believe who just walked in." Elizabeth barely glanced up. "Who?" The bridesmaid hesitated. Daniel's best man just pointed him out. "He's sitting near the back." "Who?" she repeated. The next words hit her like a train. "Ethan Carter." Elizabeth's heart stopped. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. The name was like a ghost, a shadow of a life she had locked away years ago. She turned sharply. "What did you just say?" The bridesmaid blinked. "Ethan Carter. You're..." Elizabeth didn't hear the rest. She shot to her feet, nearly knocking over a perfume bottle. The room spun as memories she had buried long ago crashed into her like waves. Ethan, her first love. The boy who had once held her heart so completely, before life had pulled them apart. The one who had taught her what love truly felt like. Raw, imperfect, real. And now, after all these years, he was here. Her hands trembled as she pushed past the bridesmaids and strode toward the window overlooking the garden. Guests were filing into the ceremony space, elegant in their designer dresses and tailored suits. And then, amid the sea of high society, she saw him. Ethan. Her breath hitched. He was standing near the back, dressed in a simple but well-fitted black suit, hands in his pockets. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, unaware that she was watching him from above. He looked different, older, stronger. His once boyish face had been carved by time, his jawline sharper, his presence somehow more commanding. But it was him. Memories surged like wildfire. The summer nights spent on his rooftop, staring at the stars. The stolen kisses in the back of his father's old pickup truck. The way he had held her when she cried, promising her that no matter what happened, they'd always find their way back to each other. She had believed that once. But life had other plans. He had come from nothing. A struggling musician with dreams bigger than his bank account. Her family had never approved. "You have a future to protect," her mother had told her the night before she left for college. "He is not part of it." And so, she had walked away. And now, on the day she was supposed to commit herself to another man, Ethan had returned. Why? Why now? Her pulse thundered in her ears. "Elizabeth." Her mother's voice snapped her back to reality. She turned slowly. Vivian stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. "I saw you looking out the window," her mother said coolly. "You saw him, didn't you?" Elizabeth's throat was dry. "You knew he was here." Vivian exhaled sharply. "Of course I knew. Do you think people come to a wedding like this uninvited?" Daniel's security pointed him out the moment he arrived. Elizabeth clenched her fists. "And you didn't think to tell me?" Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because it doesn't matter." "It does matter." Vivian stepped forward, voice low and firm. "No, it doesn't. You are marrying Daniel Caldwell, Elizabeth, not some boy who couldn't give you the life you deserve." The words were like a slap. Elizabeth's heart pounded. She turned back to the window, her gaze locking onto Ethan once more. He had looked up now, scanning the bridal suite as if searching for something. For her. And in that instant, she knew. This wasn't a coincidence. Ethan Carter hadn't just stumbled into her wedding. He had come for a reason. And suddenly, for the first time in years, Elizabeth found herself wondering. What if she had made a mistake all those years ago? And what if, right now, she was about to make an even bigger one? The weight of a choice. Elizabeth's pulse pounded in her ears as she stepped away from the window, her hands gripping the silk fabric of her wedding dress. Ethan Carter. He was here. Not in a dream. Not in a distant memory. Not in the pages of an old diary she had hidden in the back of her closet. Here, on her wedding day, her mind swirled with questions. Why? Why now? What did he want? She turned toward the full-length mirror, expecting to see the same woman she had seen earlier, the picture-perfect bride in a designer gown, draped in wealth and expectation. But this time, all she saw was a woman who looked trapped. A knock at the door made her jump. It wasn't a bridesmaid. It wasn't her mother. It was Daniel. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. "I need a moment," she called, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. But the door creaked open anyway. Daniel Caldwell stood in the doorway, radiating power and control as he always did. His tailored tuxedo fit him like it had been made just for him. Because, of course, it had been. "You look breathtaking," he said smoothly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. His eyes roamed over her, but Elizabeth wasn't sure if he was looking at her or just admiring the way she looked in the dress he had approved. She forced a smile. "You're not supposed to see the bride before the wedding." He smirked. "I don't believe in bad luck. We make our own luck, don't we?" His words, meant to be charming, sent a strange chill down her spine. Daniel reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips. The diamond ring he had placed there felt heavier than ever. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "Everyone's waiting. You're ready, aren't you?" Elizabeth hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but Daniel caught it. His grip on her hand tightened, just slightly. "What is it?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. She shook her head, forcing herself to breathe. "Nothing. Just nerves, I guess." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's normal. But you have nothing to be nervous about. This is the start of something incredible, Elizabeth. A future most people could only dream of. A future. One where she would stand beside him at high-profile galas, plastering on the perfect smile, while photographers snapped pictures. One where she would sit through dinner meetings, nodding at business associates whose names she didn't care to remember. One where she would play the role of a loving wife, bound to a man who made all the decisions. And worst of all, one where Ethan Carter no longer existed. Her chest tightened. She pulled her hand away. "I just need a moment alone," she whispered. Daniel studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Of course. Take your time." He leaned in and kissed her forehead before stepping out. The moment the door shut, Elizabeth exhaled, gripping the edge of the vanity to steady herself. "I can't do this." She squeezed her eyes shut. She was supposed to be walking down that aisle in 15 minutes, supposed to be saying vows in front of hundreds of guests, under an arch of white roses, in a ceremony so extravagant that it had been the talk of the city for months. But all she could think about was the man sitting at the back of the garden. Ethan. Without thinking, she yanked off her heels, lifting her dress slightly as she darted toward the door. The hallway was empty. No bridesmaids, no wedding coordinators. With one deep breath, Elizabeth slipped out of the bridal suite and made her way down the back staircase, her heart hammering against her ribs. She needed to see him. Just once. Just to know. A face from the past. The ceremony garden was alive with movement. Guests were mingling, laughter floating through the air, champagne glasses clinking. But Elizabeth barely noticed any of it. Her eyes locked onto the man standing near the farthest row of seats. Ethan Carter. As if sensing her presence, he turned. And then, for the first time in nearly a decade, their eyes met. 1,000 emotions hit her at once. He looked shocked, then relieved, then something else, something deeper. Elizabeth's feet moved before she could stop herself. She slipped through the crowd, her wedding gown brushing against the grass, until she was standing just inches from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. "Elizabeth," he breathed. Hearing her name in his voice again nearly shattered her. She swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know. I shouldn't be here." He let out a small, humorless laugh. "I didn't even plan to come inside. But when I saw your name on the invitation, He stopped himself. "I had to see you." Her throat tightened. "Ethan." He searched her face, eyes filled with unspoken words. "Tell me something, Elizabeth." His voice was soft but steady. "Are you happy?" The question hit her like a freight train. Because for the first time in years, she realized she didn't have an answer. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Ethan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you tell me you love him, I'll leave. I swear." His jaw clenched. "But if there's even a small part of you that still," he swallowed, "still feels something for me, then don't say I do." The words hummed between them, heavy and dangerous. Elizabeth's heart pounded. Somewhere in the distance, a violinist began playing the processional music. The ceremony was about to start. Her time was up. She had to choose. A life of certainty and wealth with Daniel, or the unknown with Ethan, the man who had once held her heart in the palm of his hand. And in that moment, Elizabeth knew, whatever choice she made would change everything. Forever. A heart divided. The violinist's melody drifted through the air, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Elizabeth's entire world had collapsed into this single moment. She stood inches from Ethan, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her fingers trembling against the silk of her wedding dress. Behind her, hundreds of guests were taking their seats, completely unaware that the bride, the perfect, elegant, poised bride, was on the verge of unraveling. Ethan's gaze locked onto hers, a storm of emotion swirling in his dark brown eyes. "If you tell me you love him, I'll leave." His words echoed in her head. Elizabeth swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She should turn away. She should walk back up those stairs, take her father's arm, and march down the aisle toward the man she had promised to marry. But her feet wouldn't move. A war raged inside her, pulling her in two opposite directions, one toward the safe, predictable life she had built with Daniel, and the other toward the reckless, untamed love she had once shared with Ethan. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Ethan exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his slightly tousled hair. He looked just as torn as she felt, as if he hadn't expected this moment to shake him so deeply. Finally, he spoke, his voice raw. "Do you remember that summer?" he asked softly. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Of course she remembered. That summer, when they were young, wild, and blissfully unaware of the future that would rip them apart. They had spent it in a small beach town on the East Coast, where the sun never seemed to set, and the ocean smelled like freedom. The two of them had spent their days tangled in sea breeze and laughter, sneaking kisses under moonlit skies, whispering promises they were too naive to understand. It was the summer she had fallen irrevocably, helplessly, dangerously in love with Ethan Carter. And it was also the summer she lost him. Tears stung her eyes. "Ethan, don't." "I have to," he interrupted, his voice hoarse. "Because I've spent the last 8 years wishing I'd fought harder for you, wishing I hadn't let you walk away." She felt her chest tighten, her body trembling. "This isn't fair," she whispered. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. "You think this is fair? You think watching you about to marry another man is fair?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "Tell me, Elizabeth, have you ever looked at Daniel the way you used to look at me?" A single tear slipped down her cheek, because she knew the answer. No, she hadn't. Not once. Ethan's eyes softened as he reached out and gently brushed the tear from her face, his fingers warm against her cool skin. "Come with me," he murmured. Elizabeth's breath hitched. "I can't," she whispered, but her voice wavered. "Yes, you can," Ethan insisted, his tone urgent. "Right now. Just take my hand, and we'll leave. We'll figure everything out later. But don't marry him if it's not what you want." Her head spun. Everything in her life had been meticulously planned. The wedding, the future, the carefully curated image of perfection she had spent years maintaining. But here was Ethan, offering her chaos, uncertainty, and risk. And the terrifying part, it had never sounded more beautiful. A voice cut through the air. "Elizabeth." Her stomach twisted violently. She turned. Her mother stood at the garden's edge, looking elegant in a navy blue gown, her expression frozen between concern and suspicion. Beyond her, through the floral archway, Elizabeth could see her father adjusting his cufflinks, standing proudly at the end of the aisle, waiting to walk his daughter toward the life she was supposed to have. And at the altar, Daniel, standing tall, his hands clasped in front of him, smiling as if nothing had changed, as if his bride wasn't standing in the shadows, moments away from making a choice that would shatter his world. The weight of expectation slammed into Elizabeth like a tidal wave. Her pulse pounded. This was it. This was the moment. One step toward Ethan, and she was throwing away everything. One step toward the altar, and she was condemning herself to a life she wasn't sure she wanted. Her mother took a step forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Elizabeth, what are you doing?" Elizabeth's lips parted, her heart clawing against her ribs like a caged bird. Then, Daniel turned. Their eyes met, and she knew. She had to decide. Now, Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Lizzie. A name she hadn't heard in years. A name that belonged to the girl she used to be. Tears blurred her vision. A deep, shuddering breath left her lips. And then, she made her choice. The world held its breath. A choice that shook the world. The world around her blurred into a dizzying haze of violin strings, whispered conversations, and the soft rustle of silk dresses brushing against the wooden chairs. Elizabeth stood at the edge of two vastly different lives. One step forward, and she would take her father's arm, walk down the petal-lined aisle, and say "I do" to Daniel, the man who had given her stability, security, and a carefully crafted love that had never quite felt whole. One step backward, and she would reach for Ethan's hand, the man who had once set her soul on fire, the man who had made her laugh so hard she forgot to breathe, the man who had shattered her heart all those years ago and then somehow found his way back. Her body was frozen, her mind spiraling. Ethan's deep brown eyes pleaded with her, raw and unguarded in a way she had never seen before. He wasn't just asking her to leave. He was asking her to remember who she was before all of this, before the expectations, before the responsibilities, before she had buried her real self beneath a life that wasn't entirely her own. Lizzie. That name, that voice, It tugged at something deep inside her, something long buried beneath years of perfectly scripted choices. Elizabeth, her mother's voice cut in. Firmer now, her high heels clicking against the stone path as she moved toward them. "What are you doing?" Elizabeth's breath hitched. What was she doing? She could feel the weight of eyes on her now. Guests whispering. The officiant shifting nervously at the altar. The delicate clockwork of her carefully planned wedding was beginning to crack, gears grinding against one another, as if the universe itself had sensed that something wasn't right. A sharp inhale. She turned toward the altar. There, standing beneath an arch of white roses, Daniel waited. His face was calm, expectant. But then, his expression flickered. Because he saw it too. The hesitation. The doubt. Daniel had always been perceptive, always prided himself on his ability to read her thoughts before she even spoke them. And right now, he was reading everything. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. In that moment, she knew. He had always known. He had always known she loved him in a way that never quite reached the depths it was supposed to. That she loved him with politeness instead of passion. That she loved him with appreciation, not obsession. That she loved him, but not completely. She felt something inside her crack wide open. Then she turned to Ethan. His gaze burned into her, unyielding, hopeful, afraid. All she had to do was reach for his hand, and she would be free. But was she ready? A sudden hush fell over the crowd. The music stopped. Her father, now standing at the entrance of the aisle, cleared his throat. "Elizabeth," he called softly, his voice laced with an unspoken warning. "It's time." A lump formed in her throat. Then, Daniel took a step forward. The crowd murmured as he walked down the aisle, straight toward her. Elizabeth braced herself. Would he demand an explanation? Would he lash out? Would he beg her to stay? But when he reached her, he did none of those things. Instead, he studied her carefully, a quiet resignation settling into his face. "I think," he said in a hushed voice, "that you already made your decision." Her breath hitched. Daniel gave her a small, sad smile. "You just haven't said it yet." She felt tears prick her eyes. "Daniel." He shook his head. "I love you, Elizabeth," he murmured, his voice breaking slightly. "But not in the way you deserve, and not in the way you love him." A sharp inhale. Then, slowly, deliberately, Daniel reached out. For a split second, she thought he would take her hand, pull her back to him, make this choice for her. But instead, he did the last thing she ever expected. He took her hand and placed it in Ethan's. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Elizabeth froze, staring up at Daniel in shock. His eyes, always so composed, glistened with unshed emotion. "Go," he whispered. And suddenly, she could breathe again. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she turned to Ethan, her fingers tightening around his. He exhaled a shaky breath, as if he hadn't dared to hope this would actually happen. And then, he pulled her in. The moment their bodies collided, a rush of memories flooded through her. Every stolen kiss, every whispered promise, every aching moment she had spent missing him. It had all led to this. She turned back to Daniel one last time, searching his face for regret, for resentment. But all she found was understanding. And maybe, just maybe, a little relief. Because he deserved more too. Then, with a final breath, Elizabeth turned and ran. Hand in hand with Ethan, she fled past the stunned guests, past the rows of perfect white chairs, past the altar where her old life had been waiting. The wind caught the hem of her gown as they raced down the garden path, laughter bubbling in her throat like a long-lost melody. And for the first time in years, she was free. The beginning after the end. Elizabeth didn't stop running. The sharp click of her heels against the stone pavement echoed in her ears, blending with the murmurs and gasps of the wedding guests left behind. She didn't dare look back, afraid that if she did, reality would catch up to her, afraid that she would see the stunned, disappointed faces of her family, her friends. Daniel. A pang of guilt lanced through her, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming rush of adrenaline in her veins. Ethan's hand was warm, firm, steady, just as she remembered. His grip never wavered, as if he had been waiting years for this moment. As if he was afraid that if he let go, she would disappear again. They reached the edge of the estate's sprawling garden, where the wedding venue gave way to the quiet streets of the city. There, under the golden glow of streetlights, Elizabeth finally stopped. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her wedding dress, now slightly dirtied at the hem, billowing around her like the remnants of a dream unraveling. Ethan turned to her, searching her face with a mixture of disbelief and raw, unfiltered emotion. "Lizzie," he murmured, barely able to speak. And in that moment, she felt it, the weight of everything that had just happened. The reality of what she had done crashed into her like a tidal wave. She had walked away from the life she had carefully built, from a man who had done nothing but love her in the best way he knew how. From the safety, the certainty, the predictability of her future. Her chest heaved, her emotions swirling in a tangled storm. Ethan cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away the tears she hadn't even realized had fallen. "Are you okay?" he whispered. She didn't know how to answer that. She wasn't sure what she was right now. I need a second," she breathed, pressing a hand against her forehead. Ethan immediately stepped back, giving her space, his expression unreadable. She let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through her perfectly curled hair that had been styled to perfection for a wedding she had just abandoned. "What did I just do?" she murmured. Ethan gave her a look that was equal parts amused and overwhelmed. "I think you just changed the course of your entire life." She swallowed hard. For years, she had convinced herself that her life was supposed to follow a certain script. That love was supposed to be comfortable, that happiness was supposed to be measured, that marriage was supposed to be a logical next step. But love wasn't logical, and happiness wasn't something you carefully planned. It was something you felt. And standing here, under the soft hum of the city lights, with Ethan looking at her like she was the only thing that had ever mattered, she felt it. A slow smile spread across her lips. "I can't believe I just did that," she whispered. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Me neither." Then, after a beat, "I would have fought for you, you know," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Her breath hitched. "I would have fought for you back then," he continued, his eyes burning into hers. "I would have chased you if I thought I had even the slightest chance, but you were already halfway into another life before I could even reach you." She swallowed, her throat tight. "You left first." The words came out softer than she expected, filled with something deeper than just pain, understanding. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling. "I did, and I regret it. Every single day." Silence stretched between them. Then, softly, she asked, "What now?" Ethan let out a breathless laugh. "I don't know. We didn't exactly think this far ahead." She bit her lip, glancing around, suddenly aware of how surreal this entire moment was. "We should probably leave before someone finds me." Ethan grinned. Agreed. He pulled out his phone and called for a car. Within minutes, a sleek black sedan pulled up beside them. Elizabeth hesitated for only a second before stepping in. The moment the door shut, she felt a strange sense of peace. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know how the world would react to what she had just done. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. The fallout. By morning, the world knew. Her phone had exploded with calls, texts, and notifications. Every major media outlet had picked up the story. Runaway bride. Harris Elizabeth Williams abandons wedding in shocking twist. A love triangle at the altar. The scandal everyone is talking about. Who is Ethan Carter? The man who stole the bride's heart. Her mother had called 17 times. Her father, only once, but she knew that conversation would be the hardest one. And Daniel. She swallowed as she scrolled through her unread messages. Daniel had only sent one text. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Her chest ached. He deserved more than this. More than the way she had left him standing there, humiliated and heartbroken in front of hundreds of guests. She would apologize, really apologize, when the time was right. But for now, she looked over at Ethan, who was sitting on the balcony of their hotel suite, sipping coffee as he scrolled through the same headlines. When he caught her staring, he raised an eyebrow. "Regrets." She exhaled, walking toward him. "No," she said softly. Ethan studied her for a moment before setting his coffee down and pulling her into his arms. She melted into him, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his heart. "I have no idea where this is going," she murmured against his chest. Ethan smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Neither do I." And for the first time in her life, that was okay.